praat achter een scherm. Dan kan mensen niet dan nog iets gaan doen.
Ik weet het, we hebben een lange werkdag gehad. Maar ik ga even proberen in te loggen. Voor het geval dat er eens iets misgaat, maar dat kan toch bijna niet. Ze had nog wel een meeting, dus misschien loopt die meeting ineens uit of zo.
Dat is ook altijd wat. Ik vind het zelf nog zo goed doen. Maar
Dat is die elephant in the room.
Ja. Nou, ik dacht ik probeer even in te loggen. Maar dat is altijd best pittig inloggen bij, in het systeem bij ons.
Vorige keer hadden we ook een laatkomen.
Ja, maar het is wel fijn.
Komt die weer dan?
Ik dacht, laat ik het niet met die woorden zeggen, maar
Nou ja,
het komt in de buurt.
wij kunnen niet zoveel verkeerd doen. Dus,
Nee, maar...
ik heb ook geen mail ontvangen. Dus,
nee, dan is het gewoon goed. Je moet Sam ook gewoon...
oh, iets komt...
Dat doen zij...
Hello and welcome, live from The Hague. My name is Sophie Derkzen. I'm a journalist and moderator, and I welcome you very warmly on behalf of the Netherlands Atlantic Association and the Netherlands Atlantic Youth for this Atlantic dialogue in which we speak with guests with a distinguished career in foreign policy, foreign affairs, in order for them to share their insights with especially a younger generation. And we're very pleased to at least have some exponents of that generation here with us in The Hague. For today's edition, I'd like to introduce you to Constanze Stelzenmüller. As you can hear, she's originally from Germany, but she works in Washington for 7 years already. She works currently as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She works as a columnist for the Financial Times, and she's currently holding the Fritz Stern chair. And of course, with all of that, she is a leading expert in transatlantic relations, but especially in German foreign policy. Constanze Stelzenmüller, Frau Dr. Stelzenmüller, I would say in Germany, but we agreed we do it the American style, and I can just say, hello, Constanze. Welcome.
Hi there, Sophie. Hi, Ms. Derkzen. It's a pleasure to be there, and yes, I much prefer the first name.
Great. We'll go on a first name basis from now on. The aim of this dialogue is, as I said, to exchange views with the younger generation. I was curious. I mean, you have had a long career in foreign policy, but you started studying in Bonn and Geneva. You were at Harvard, Kennedy later on. What do you think is the most striking difference between, let's say, the time that you studied and the mentality of students then and the students that you meet nowadays?
All right. Well, thank you very much. I was just thinking this must mean that I am now officially old, which is all right.
No pun intended.
No, it's perfectly all right. And I also want to say again to the listeners what I was saying to you and your colleagues earlier. I would much rather be in The Hague than sitting at my dining room table in Washington, D.C. Although I will say that the cicadas haven't reached inner DC yet. They appear to be in the suburbs, but not, the plague that comes every 17 years. So it's a beautiful spring day outside. No cicadas yet here. And so it's actually quite a nice time to be here. Now, as regards studying, I think that perhaps my personal experience was a bit special. I am what is called in American a foreign service brat. In other words, my father was in the German Foreign Service, and I had spent most of my life outside of Germany, which was somewhat unusual, and came back to Germany in 1979. I was underage. I was a bit too young for this. And I'm about to turn 59. I'm not going to be coy about my age. And I came to Bonn to go to law school. Basically because that was the only place in Germany that I knew, and because my mother had talked me out of studying Chinese and Japanese.
How unfortunate, I would say.
I'm not sure. At the time, my mother had done full Oriental studies, Arabic and Hebrew and Farsi, and said, it's basically like going into a monastery. What you do is linguistics and literature, which is what she had done in Frankfurt in the 50s. And that was also true, at least for sinology, which was my main interest at that time, because there was no way you were going to be able to travel to China. You were perhaps going to be able to go to Taiwan. But my mother said, it is sort of impractical and it will limit you. And I think that in retrospect, that was right. But the reason I say all this is that Bonn in the first half of the 80s was a sort of special place. We were in the last decade of the Cold War. There's a famous movie made about this time by Margarete von Trotter called Die Bleierne Zeit, The Leaden Time, and that is how it felt to me. The Red Army faction was still on a killing spree. In fact, they killed one of my father's colleagues in front of the German Foreign Ministry in 1986. In the same city, and so all the ministries were surrounded by barbed wire, NATO wire, razor wire, and there were armored personnel carriers patrolling, the leafy suburban streets of Bonn, which made it feel a little bit as though this was a country under siege. And I remember my parents visiting me on a homestay, and literally jumping a foot when one of these APCs rolled out from a side street. And they were saying, what is this? And I said, well, welcome to Germany. You haven't lived here for a while, have you? And then, of course, it was also the time of the big demonstrations against the missiles. And so Bonn, at regular intervals, doubled its population. And there were demonstrators from all over the country. There were angry farmers on tractors and so on. And it was all pretty wild. And so, frankly, in this combination of sort of late Cold War depression, anger, a feeling that there was domestic terrorism could hit you at any moment, gave all of us a sense that this was somehow an unhealthy place to be. And many of my generation who didn't think this was normal and just the way things were supposed to be, tried to get out of Germany as soon as possible. And that's why I did that. That's why I went to America. I was very lucky to get a fellowship to Harvard. And then, in 1989, everything changed. But that is a distinctive element of the atmosphere in which I was a student. And the other thing perhaps to keep in mind was that my generation, 1962, was the second largest generational cohort to hit German universities who were not prepared for it. And literally our professors were trying to scare us away. And the labor market, we had high unemployment, we had a bad economy, and literally the feeling was that you needed to get out of the country if you possibly could. And I think that is something that perhaps we have in common with today's generation that feels very insecure economically, very unable to plan, and that has a general feeling, that international and national governance is kind of a mess. And that they're inheriting something that they don't quite know how to repair.
Thank you. You've vividly sketched Germany at the time, 1989. I assume that we will get back to that point in history later on in the conversation. In your Twitter bio, you describe yourself as a Germany explainer at Brookings. I was curious, what is the biggest misunderstanding that you come across about Germany when you walk around in Washington?
Well, I think there is we are both vilified and glorified. And I think both of those things sort of get it wrong. And then there are all these sort of what I call sticky narratives, the cliches about Germany that, debt is considered the same thing as guilt. And therefore, is a bad thing. Presumably, the Dutch can relate to that a little better than others. But and then on the other hand, there are these sort of glorifying narratives about, how wonderfully Germany is run and that Angela Merkel is the best of all chancellors we have ever had. And I'm not, I actually think that we're a solid, fairly stable country. And that Angela Merkel is in many ways a pretty damn good chancellor, although I have criticisms. So I'm somewhere in the middle. If I get shot at from both sides, I feel that I'm doing the right thing. But the truth is that what people really don't understand is, and I've been thinking about this because I've just written a book proposal on reunified Germany and its foreign and security policy. And I think what people really don't understand is just how massive the transformations were that Germany underwent in 1989 and the years thereafter. And that many of these transformations are still sort of not quite digested. For example, that the population movements around 1990 with the reunification and the dissolution of the Soviet Union were much, much bigger than the migration crisis that hit us in 2015 and 2016. And that's just to give you an example.
What I suggest for this conversation is that...
Sorry, I'm losing your tone.
Oh, okay. Is it better now?
Can't hear you.
Okay. We'll see
God.
technically
Yes.
whether... Yes,
you're back.
We're back.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And I'll just
Yikes.
continue. For this conversation, I was about to suggest that we will roughly follow the pathway of your career, meaning from Berlin to Washington. So we'll first zoom in on Germany and the broader European perspective on transatlantic relationship, and then switch to the US perspective and talk about present-day America.
Sure.
You've already mentioned that, of course, Germany is heading for federal elections. We know that Angela Merkel is finishing her tenure. Interestingly, as you just mentioned as well, I guess in the Netherlands, but in main parts of the Western world, there is a rather positive evaluation of her work. But over the last, I would say, months, maybe even years, we see a much more critical evaluation. You yourself are also a mild critic. You've just recently published this article in Foreign Policy, what's it called? The Merkel Model and its Limits. Yeah. For example, The Economist has been arguing for quite some time, and I paraphrase here, Angela Merkel has not really prepared Germany for the future. I was curious, would you agree? And could you give us concrete examples where you see that deficit?
Sure, that's something I agree with, and I wrote it in this piece, which appeared in Foreign Affairs, not in Foreign Policy.
Sorry, Foreign Affairs.
It's don't worry. Just in case somebody wants to look it up. I think that, Merkel really did steer the country through some astounding crises ever since her taking power in 2005. I mean, let's just recap. We're talking about the country was in economically bad shape, although it was beginning to pick up when she took over. Then we had the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, which morphed into the Eurozone crisis, where several European countries had to ask for bailouts under very disputed conditions, where Germany's policies were both reviled and praised. And then we had the Ukraine crisis 2014, the migration crisis 2015 and 16, and of course in 2017, the election of Donald Trump, which was a four-year-long crisis for the German-American relationship. So things have been pretty relentless. And arguably at the same time, you had these subtle tectonic shifts around the country, with the security landscape getting darker and darker all the time. With sort of conflicts heating up in the Eastern Mediterranean, Northern Africa, and our situation in Afghanistan becoming more and more untenable, and of course, the crises in Belarus and an ongoing Russian proxy war in Eastern Ukraine. I think that Merkel, in many ways, held Europe together in that time. She, I think, was again and again the broker of solutions which many people didn't like, but most people stuck to. And I think the other thing that's sort of worth pointing out, given the other alternatives that we've had, at least in German post-war history, is that she is a person of impeccable integrity. I mean, she didn't drink, she didn't have affairs, she didn't sit, she didn't have sort of dodgy relationships with authoritarian powers, although you can criticize her relationships with Beijing and the Kremlin. But there's not a hint of corruption around this woman, and I think her rationalism is beyond a doubt.
This is all praise so far.
Sorry?
This is all praise so far.
Yes, and I mean that seriously. But at the same time, I think what became clearer and clearer and has become very obvious within the last year of her tenure now is that this mode of balancing incrementalism that so characterizes her method of exercising power and diplomacy is no longer adequate to a time in which disruption after disruption is sort of shaking the foundations of our Western democracies in Europe, and even that of the powerful and wealthy Germany. And I think the critique that I take most seriously, and yes, I share it with the Economist, is that I think for those of us who think about these things, who work in this field, it's clear that Germany and other Western democracies as well, have to undertake painful transformation of their economies, make their systems of governance more resilient against populism, and in general make them more resilient against interference by authoritarian adversaries. And that's something we have not done adequately. We are far from having responded to those challenges adequately. And that is, I think, is a harsh critique and the one that's going to stick in retrospect.
Well, let's take a closer look then at one of the dossiers on Merkel's desk that has been reviewed very critically, especially since it plays an important role in the German relationship with the US, obviously. Merkel has refused, despite pressure from the US, to suspend the Gazprom pipeline, the project Nord Stream 2, which is intended to bring Russian natural gas to Germany, circumventing Ukrainian and Polish transit routes. I know that you've said before that you actually think that this example is a rather superficial one, not really addressing the larger strategic question as to concerns of how should Europe relate to Russia, how should this larger strategic question be answered. But still, because many people also participating in this talk have asked beforehand about this project, I would be curious to hear what, in your opinion, should be done to the project. And also I'm curious, why do you think this is not really a good case to address the larger strategic question?
Okay. Yes. Well, I've written about this more times than I care to remember in my FT column and elsewhere. And yes, I am on record as saying this project is economically probably unnecessary, perhaps unviable, and politically a huge mistake because it's been poisoning our relationship with our Eastern European neighbors. It makes Ukraine distrustful, and it certainly hasn't been good for the relationship with America. So that said, I think the sort of maximalist demand, which is, rip the pipeline out of the Baltic Sea, is unrealistic. The German courts take eminent domain actions by the government very seriously. Sorry, this is me, the lawyer, talking. Eminent domain means, in German word is Enteignung. In other words, this would be an act similar to an expropriation by the government if you told these companies to stop building this pipeline. And it would, there is in fact legal precedent for this happening because that's exactly what happened after Merkel took Germany out of nuclear energy after the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011 in March. And the companies that operated nuclear power plants in Germany sued the German government for billions of euros. And the estimate is that stopping, putting a stop to Nord Stream 2 would cost somewhere between 9 and 12 billion euros. That's not exactly small change. And the pragmatic solution here, it seems to me, is available, which is, to finish the damn thing, and then sort of make it very clear to the Russians, there will be consequences to the operation of this if you fiddle with the energy supply security of any of our eastern neighbors. That includes particularly the EU and NATO member states, but it also includes Ukraine. The other reason why I think this is feasible is that things have really changed since 2014. We have submitted to the full application of the EU energy package. We have much better gas storage capabilities. So in case the Russians tried to turn off the taps, we would be supplied for several months. And also, and this is crucial, we have greatly improved reverse flow capabilities. In other words, if these storage capabilities are in Germany, we can reverse engineer the flow back to Eastern Europe and to Ukraine. And we have also invested a great deal in Ukrainian economic and political transformation. Not enough, I grant you, but really a lot has happened in the intervening 7 years. But what we're really missing, and this is really concerning as far as I'm concerned, is worrying, is the larger question of the relationship of the European Union and NATO with a Russia whose regime is clearly feeling more insecure and therefore being sort of, opportunistically aggressive. And what that means for European security, but also for the viability of the alliance. And there are a lot of different components to this. There's a corruption component, there is an arms control component, there is a defense and nuclear deterrence component, a lot of moving pieces that while we are focusing idiotically, in my view, on this one pipeline, we're sort of not considering the larger picture. Sorry, that was a long explanation, but it's necessary because otherwise you immediately get pegged as being on one, extreme side of this story.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me shift gears and bring up security then, because you've just touched upon that subject as well. Mm-hmm. I know, you wrote before, like Merkel's hesitation to stand up to Moscow, German military weakness has undercut the security of Europe and NATO as a whole. Let's try to address that enormous strategic question that you want to address. What would be your advice to Merkel here in order to save her legacy then? How to come to a more profound answer to that question of yours?
You know what? I don't give advice to people who govern. That's not my, that would be presumptuous. And Merkel doesn't need it. And also, there's really not a lot of time. We're going to the polls on September 26th. There's really not much that can happen right now. But
then at least brainstorm freely.
Well, Merkel's successor, I think, whoever that is, and I think the field really is wide open at this point. Merkel's successor really is in some ways the first German chancellor post-war to have to consider the foreign and security policy of the country as a sort of seamless entity of domestic and foreign security, and as not just a task of maintaining and balancing out the status quo, but of managing change and managing transformations that make us more resilient against a future where disruptions and crises will be much more common. Yeah, that's not something that, and again, that brings me back to my law school experience, because it so happens I went to law school with some of the candidates. I wrote about this in one of my columns in March a year ago.
I'm afraid I missed that one.
With Merz.
Yeah. I said I'm afraid I missed that column. We're very curious to hear which candidates. Friedrich Merz, oder?
So Merz, Laschet, Röttgen, and the execrable Hans-Georg Maaßen all went to law school in Bonn at the same time that I did.
Incredible.
All of them. Yes. Also Guido Westerwelle, the foreign minister who sadly died of cancer. It wasn't exactly the same time. I came back as a tutor after going to Harvard, so this spans about a decade, but most of it, I do remember some of them from the library and from the corridors. But what it does mean is that I have a very specific understanding of the mindset of the time that shaped these guys. And I can tell you that it's very different from the mindset of, say, Annalena Baerbock. Now, that's a genuine generational difference.
Let me just zip in for the viewers, who are not so familiar with the German context. Annalena Baerbock is the candidate of the Greens, who is actually now...
Yes, I thought that by now she's become such a pop star that everybody in the Netherlands would know the name. But yes, she is 40 years old. She likes to remind people that she was born in the year that the Greens were founded in 1980, which was when I just started going to university. And I think that generation has an entirely different take on, they don't know anything but reunified Germany. She was 9-year-old when the two countries were sort of welded together again. And the sort of complacencies and certainties and sense of entitlement that I thought were really, really strong among the guys that I went to law school with, and that I think I still see sort of shades of as I see them in their mid to late 50s. That I think is absent in this generation of politicians, who are much more international. The other thing was absurdly that I was warned when I went to Harvard that this would be bad for my career. And that if I didn't stay in Germany and do a purely sort of German course of legal education, that I would have trouble reinserting myself into into the workforce. And I say this because Annalena Baerbock is now, there's a real sort of disinformation operation out in social media against her, part of which apparently comes from Russia. And part of it includes trying to denigrate her academic education because she got a master in international law at the LSE. And people are saying, but she's not a juristin. She doesn't have a German legal education. And of course, that's not good enough, which I find utterly absurd and very provincial.
Understand. Let's say that we will get back to the future of Germany and the Greens a bit later on, but I want to stick to security, if you permit me.
Sure,
just for a while, pausing there, because I guess you wrote in 2015, so a bit longer ago, a policy brief for the German Marshall Fund, in which you argued that simply increasing the defense spending in European countries wouldn't solve the problem of Europe's dependency on the US, of course, also very much the case for Germany. Do you still think so? I mean, if that is not the solution, what would solve the problem of Europe's dependency on the US?
Well, look, one of the ironies of the recent years is that we have actually doubled our defense budget, and we're still nowhere, we're still at about, somewhere between 0.2 and 0.5% of GDP. The reason why we're a little, on the higher end is, of course, because of the pandemic, GDP slump, which means that our spending is a larger percentage because GDP has gone down. But the truth is that, successive, and this is, I think, one of the sort of undigested transformations of unification in 1989, is that as German Defense Minister Volker Rühr, who was Helmut Kohl's defense minister at the time, famously said, we were now encircled by friends. And most Germans, including, and not just conservative or green ones, but also conservatives, I think misread this as meaning that we could now basically disarm, and that we could now, or, we had finally the German recipe of reconciliation and embracing everybody had won out. We were the victors of history together with the Americans, and everybody would want to be like us, and we could trade with everybody. And what people, I think, failed to understand, sadly, is that what we had done was to export our security dilemmas to Europe's periphery. In other words, that dilemmas that had been, personal to us growing up, being a frontier state in the Cold War, were suddenly the dilemmas, as I said earlier, of Estonia and Romania, or Italy with regards to Libya. And I think the challenge here is not so much defense spending, to get back to your original question, but a change of mindset, of how we think about our security that has German leaders, and this is something that Angela Merkel did not do, explain to the German voter that Estonia's and Italy's and Romania's security is our security. That is what NATO means. Also, because in the wake of unification, we exported part of our manufacturing to lower wage countries in Eastern Europe. The Visegrad 4, the German auto industry is profoundly economically interdependent with the Visegrad 4, and we could not sell cars to China at the prices that we do without having car parts manufactured in Slovakia or the Czech Republic. And so the security of the Czech Republic is very much of interest to the German car industry in Stuttgart. And honestly, I would really like the next German chancellor to make that point very forcefully. And again, that sounds terribly egoistic. I'm just trying to pinpoint a sort of national interest argument that the ordinary voter would understand. I obviously have a lot of other arguments, and they begin with values. But this is, these are, it is, I think, terribly important to make it clear to people that we are defending ourselves when we defend Romania, and that and that it is conceptualizing European security as an integral whole that then leads to an assessment of what kind of defense spending we need. And if you want me to be specific about that, I would say, well, because we are geographically the hub nation in Europe, and because we're also much bigger than most of our neighbors, that suggests that we need to be a hub for military mobility, but also the backbone for a lot of smaller European countries that can no longer afford to have anything but boutique specialized forces, and where America has other fish to fry or other security priorities. I don't want to be flip here. We need to be able, in small to medium-sized operations in the European periphery, to provide the kind of backbone that in the past only the Americans supplied in NATO. Okay, so mobility and force and backbone for force structures are two key things that need to be that need to be visible in our defense budget. And there, I'm not even talking about drones and nuclear, dual capability aircraft and so on, which are also highly conflict-laden topics right now in the election campaign.
I want to bring in another big theme in the relationship that you've just touched upon, being China, and you mentioned the car industry, the German car industry. I guess that's another fierce point of criticism addressed at Merkel's. Sure. On both sides of the Atlantic, actually. Merkel pushed through this Chinese-EU investment agreement in the end of last year under the German presidency. What does this tell us about the German-American relationship?
I'm inclined to be a little more relaxed about that. I'm more relaxed about the agreement than I am about Merkel's China policy. Let me put it that way. And again, it's sort of in the same way that I think that Nord Stream 2 is kind of a tactical distraction from a larger strategic problem. I think the agreement was a tactical win for the Chinese and upset the incoming Biden administration because they were, unlike their predecessor, observing the rules of protocol and not sort of reaching out to allies in the transition period. They were being more Catholic than the Pope, in other words. And so you had this somewhat helpful, that's perhaps not the best expression to use in the Netherlands, but you had this somewhat helpless tweet from the incoming National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, saying we would appreciate consultations on this agreement. And the Germans were saying, EU presidency, we've had this on our list, we're checking it off. I think that this, as is so often the case, it was a tactical win for an authoritarian challenger. It put the Germans on the back foot diplomacy, and in that sense, it was an advantage for the incoming Biden team because they could take the high road and say, well, you're in a bit of a pickle, aren't you now? But the truth is that the agreement per se in no way inhibits a larger strategic conversation between Washington and Berlin, which is sorely necessary. And here, however, you have a very interesting situation, which is that a lot of the German national security community, and this is bipartisan. In fact, some of the sharpest critics of this are among the Social Democrats, saying that Merkel's China policy is too pro-Chinese, is too much concentrated on balancing, and that we need to be far more critical of Chinese behavior, not just in Hong Kong or with regard to minorities in China like the Uyghurs, but also with regard to their behavior in Europe. And that is unacceptable, and we need to take a harsher tone. And you've seen the German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, who's not exactly known to be an attack dog, criticizing his Chinese counterpart who was standing next to him a couple months ago and saying, we don't accept this kind of, wolf warrior bullying. And the Chinese were very upset by this and went off huffing and puffing because they clearly hadn't expected this. So I think that the next chancellor in Berlin will, I think, have to make major adjustments there. And what I don't think is, this is often represented by the sort of China enthusiasts as, they say, but America wants us to decouple. I think that's not true. This government is pretty hawkish on China here. But, decoupling is illusory in an interdependent world, even for America. What we do need to do is make ourselves, our economies and our politics more resilient. In other words, protect ourselves against, economic espionage and stealing of technology. And we need to make ourselves politically more resilient against bullying and against the Chinese either, splitting the Europeans or trying to force us into some sort of alignment with Beijing positions. Those are the real challenges. And there, frankly, I think we need every help that we can get. But also, conversely, the Americans really need us. And that, in my view, is an opportunity to somewhat rebalance the transatlantic relationship. We need each other to figure this one out. Sorry, you're looking very critical. Was that too...
No, I was just thinking which path to choose now, because actually I wanted to come back to what you just said before. I guess that this whole discussion about the Chinese-European agreement also illustrated pretty clearly how divided Europe is internally. And I guess that I heard you say somewhere before that actually this idea of Europe being internally divided has not sufficiently arrived in Washington. How would you say is that image of Europe
they have noticed
to be corrected?
I mean, they have noticed the Hungarians. They have noticed, the Poles. I mean, in other words, the sort of democracy and rule of law problems that we have become very evident. And of course, in the Trump era, we weren't exactly sort of marching in unison. Every capital was here and trying to, gain a kind of a foothold. And that included Berlin, trying to find some way of talking to the Trump administration that wouldn't, lead to a blow up of the whole relationship. And I'd say we all failed in interestingly different ways.
In blowing up the relationships, what do you mean?
Well, no, we failed. We failed in sort of getting on the right side of Donald Trump because maybe that's not possible, at least not at any price that's acceptable to a normal human being. But the thing is that I think that there are a lot of people here, more than you would think, that know Europe quite well. And that do understand the cultural differences and the political divergences and think that, we have value as allies nonetheless. That said, what I think is missing here, and we talk about this here a lot, my colleagues and me here at Brookings, is that the Biden administration has a somewhat traditionalist sense of its Western European or its European allies, which is that, we're the good guys because we're democracies, and but we're useful to the extent that we act cohesively, and when we don't, we're a pain in the neck. What I think they don't really have a firm grasp on is, a sense of the different potential political futures for Europe, and what the drivers would be for Europe, to go down one path or another, and what America's interests are there. And how America can act to, shall we say, prevent the sort of the more unfortunate versions of these futures. I think that's not really thought through. And again, because China is such a high level, such an urgent priority, that everything else, has been seen as, it's either useful to that end or not. And so they've deprioritized the Middle East, they've deprioritized Russia, and of course that's now coming back to bite them. And in all these questions, we do actually have a role to play, always assuming that we can manage to speak with one voice, which is, as we know, quite difficult.
But so far, we have actually detected differences on current issues between the US and Germany, in particular Europe in a broader sense. If we would seek for common ground, which you also keep stressing is very important, especially because the window we are looking at may not be broader than 2 years because of the midterm elections in the US coming up. Well, you would say it means it's important to find targeted areas of cooperation. Is there any low-hanging fruit so to speak? Where to start?
Oh, I think there are, and I think it is. My greatest worry right now is that key European governments are so introverted, either because of domestic issues or because of election periods. We're in the middle. The French are clearly beginning. That we sort of fail to see just how important it is for us and for our security and welfare to grasp the opportunity of the most Atlanticist, most pro-European American government in a generation. And for all we know, it could be the last one. And I feel that particularly my own country is hanging back unaccountably, and that is a huge strategic mistake. Again, I'm not suggesting, that we be, sort of obedient vassals or stuff like that. Oh, that's ridiculous. It wouldn't enter my mind. I think there are a lot of things that, even with the Biden administration, we'd have to somehow find a way to manage disagreement, to agree to disagree. Yeah, but we also, I think, need each other so existentially that it is foolish. Is very risky behavior not to understand that we have a national stake in the success of this administration. And so, yes, there are low-hanging fruit. I would say that, basically, doing more for European security at its eastern periphery, doing more in the Mediterranean, where for a variety of reasons the liminal European and NATO member states don't want a NATO sticker on the strategic framing or on military operations. That would be something we could do either in an EU context or in a coalition of the willing context, but coordinate with the Americans politically. Those are just two things. I think in the Middle East, Iran in particular, what I'm hearing here is that European diplomats are saying, just get back into the JCPOA and we'll talk about the rest later. That's worrisome because it's inadequate to the development of Iran's role in the region. I mean, Iran is Hamas's main backer, right? And so if we don't have a parallel conversation next to the Iranian nuclear weapons conversation about Iran's backing of terrorist groups in the region and other sort of attempts to gain regional hegemony, we are not going to get very far with an otherwise very willing Biden administration. Again, sorry, these are sort of complex policy issues. They're hard to put in in one or two sentences, but there really are opportunities for us, but I think we need to be a little less unbending. Yeah?
On what dossiers in particular? Unbending?
As I said, Eastern Mediterranean security, Iran,
Okay.
Eastern European security. Just do more to provide for our own security. I think do more for Belarus, do more for Ukrainian transformation. That would be a start. And in general, just lean into problems more.
Since we're coming to, let's say, the last 15 minutes of this conversation, I would like to come back to where you started, being 1989 as a starting point. Zooming out a bit further on how to characterize the current transatlantic relationship, the Biden administration is known for being, let's say, having a classical understanding of a transatlanticism. If you compare where we stand today to let's say, the transatlantic world in 1989, how do we do in 2021? Is this transatlantic alliance still a role model to the rest of the world? Is there still enough common ground? And what is the attraction, if any, to others?
Look, I think it is. I mean, I think the transatlantic alliance is in many ways a miracle. I mean, it's composed of what is it, 30 countries now with wildly different security interests. And in a world that, brings enormous pressures to bear on the members of this alliance, and yet we continue to function as an alliance. Yeah. I find that astonishing, but I think it's preserved the peace on a continent that was, forged out of the crucible of 2 world wars. My parents were war children. My father was drafted in 1944 as a 17-year-old into the Wehrmacht, basically because my grandmother had the intelligence to prevent him from falling into the clutches of the SS. And so I think that we Europeans owe a great deal of prosperity and safety and happiness to this alliance. And I think it behooves us to consider how, we can keep up our end of the bargain. And we are looking at an America that is much changed. But what I see here, particularly from the younger generation in the sort of security debate in Washington, is not anti-alliance, but it's much more questioning of priorities. It says, well, how does climate change factor into all this? Why are we in all these wars, and why can't the Europeans do more? Explain that to us again. And also, the battle in this country over cultural hegemony isn't over yet. January 6th was a spike, but it's not the end of that story. And I think if we can help as alliance members, as allies, make the case that solidarity with Europe is in America's interests to that generation, that would be pretty important, because there are people here who would answer that question very differently if they got a chance again. And we also, keep in mind that we learned from John Bolton's book that Trump was much closer to taking America out of NATO than we think. And once he had taken it out, it would have been quite difficult for America to get back in again. And who knows who would have thought of that as an encouragement. But meanwhile, we have internal challenges from Turkey, from Hungary, from others. There are a lot of problems there that we are failing to fix, and that I think we need to be more energetic in attempting to fix. Again, to sort of prove that we understand what the alliance with America is worth it to us, but also what we are worth to ourselves. Yeah.
I'm just curious. I noticed that you use "we" for "we Europeans," right? So
yes, I know. And that's, look, I don't want to make it sound as though I thought that German national interests were automatically European national interests. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was just curious on a more personal note, closing as well, whether you actually at this moment feel like a European American or an American European because of your using and how you use the word "we."
I feel, I have sort of said to friends, I'm a proud European with a German passport and who is transatlantically minded. I suppose that to some, this sort of European contextualization will sound soppy. And I also am fully aware that German politicians have liked to use the European flag, or have been past masters at sailing under European flag while pursuing firmly national interests. Guilty as charged. Our 17-year foreign minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher was the absolute samurai master at this, and some Germans, I think, bought into that narrative. That's not me. I try, and pre-pandemic times. In fact, when I arrived here, Brookings hired me, and my Twitter bio says this, as a Germany explainer. And I said, well, that's kind of limiting to what I do. And frankly, I can't even do that unless I actually spend a lot of time in other European capitals. Yeah. There is really no such thing as talking about Europe if you aren't, in The Hague or in Warsaw or in Rome and in Stockholm and Tallinn and Madrid, and talk to people there because you sort of have to represent the choir a little bit. Also because there's not that many Europeans here. I think if there were more of us, I wouldn't feel quite so obligated to do this. But the reality is that, I think one of the mistakes Europeans make is not to send enough researchers to Washington and not to get enough Americans to work and live in Europe on the topics that you and I have been talking about. I think it's time to rebuild that bridge in both directions.
Before, I'd like to go to the choir of young Europeans that we have present here. So wake up everybody in the room for some final questions of yours. I'd like to ask you, Constanze, just a question that has been pending over our conversation. I mean, you've listed an enormous list of tasks for the future German Chancellor, especially in terms of security. And since we are, of course, it's still almost 6 months away. Am I right there? Yeah, well, in September, Germany is going to the polls, but still it looks as if the Greens have a fair chance of doing very well there. How are the chances then for all, let's just take security, under a Green Chancellor? I mean, with all your wishes that you've come up with.
I think that the Greens have, Washington security establishment is practically salivating at the prospect of a Green Chancellor. Which I think recognizes the fact that the Greens really have done their homework. One, to make themselves compatible with a CDU coalition, but also, and they were already hoping for that in 2017. So they've been doing this for quite a while, and arguably they've been doing it since for the last 25 years, since the famous pizza connection in Bonn, where conservatives and Greens were meeting in an Italian restaurant to talk about a black-green coalition. This is a mythical part of German political history. But the other side of that is, of course, that the Green party base is a lot more sort of, shall we say, diverse, and the Greens have a powerful left wing. And the left wing has some quite strong views on things like military intervention, on drones, and of course nuclear participation. And so I think the Greens would have a fair lot of internal moderation to do if they went into coalition negotiations, which, I mean, it seems like they will in any case in September. But for example, it's not entirely clear to me that the Greens would want the foreign ministry or the defense ministry in a government. I think that the word on the street is that they would want a super environment ministry and the finance ministry. In other words, they want the domestic power ministries, which is interesting. And that's a new development for them. But I think, the Greens are in one sense a very welcome development in that they have, because they came in from the outside, they have very self-consciously done their homework, both as a political movement and on the party leadership level, to figure out among themselves what they think about certain things. Whereas in some ways, I think the more established parties, particularly the CDU and the Social Democrats, have been sort of coasting on their post-war history as we'll be in government in any case, so it doesn't really matter that much. And so they, in some ways, have had less hard work to do. If that makes sense to you.
Yes, of course. Well, I would love to talk further with you on let's say, the internal.
Yes, but we do need to let people ask questions.
Exactly. I'm afraid we have. No.
Listeners, I'm sorry I talked so long.
That's what you're here for. So we're really, really pleased that you shared your thoughts with us. Let me give the audience the opportunity to, let's say, pose one or maybe two very good questions. Do we have one here? Yes. Maybe just very briefly introduce yourself and pose your question.
Constanze, thank you for introducing us to the German perspective on the transatlantic relations and also your perspective on America in that case. So you already touched upon it briefly, that increasing the military spending will not solve many of the problems, the security problems we have in Europe, but changing the mindset will. So I was actually wondering, what role does Germany play in the strategic autonomy discourse in Europe, and how does it affect German-American relations? So maybe in a full utopia, the US won't play any role military in Europe. How would they feel about that?
Right. Okay. I don't want to be misunderstood by anybody as saying military spending is irrelevant. What I was saying is that you have to have a sort of clearer sense of what your strategic challenges are. Then you need to say, military mobility and force backbone are probably key elements of that, and from that derive your military spending. I'm a bit of a skeptic on the whole autonomy thing, as I think sort of the German government generally and most of the Berlin strategic community. I don't really know anybody who is a full throttle proponent of that. And part of that is, I think, because nobody really thinks that's very realistic. What I think is necessary, and here I'm sort of copying Reinhard Bütikofer, the Green legislator in the European Parliament, who always says this. It's not about European sovereignty. It is about increasing European freedom of action. Yeah. In other words, investing more in our capability to act and preserving the capability to act, stopping others from limiting it, is achievable and is important. And that allows us to say no to challenge as an adversary, but occasionally also allows us to say no to our friends. And that, I think, is a sensible thing to do. I'm part of a sort of discussion process right now in the German Council on Foreign Relations that is all about the concept of freedom of action. And I think that's much more attainable and pragmatic. And I would expect that would be something that the Dutch could get on board with.
Thank you, Constance. I think time is almost up, so let me just finish then with one last personal question. Coming back to your remark that you don't want to operate as an advisor, not to Chancellor Merkel. I've just been curious. I mean, if you look at your curriculum, you have changed roles rather often. I know that you've been working as a journalist. Now you're in this think tank world. A lot of your colleagues from the Brookings Institution have actually, changed sides and went into the Biden administration. For you,
why not me?
Not you. Assuming you still have the German nationality.
Yes,
right?
I do. And I don't even have a green card. That goes back to your question of where I identify. It never occurred to me to switch sides. And this perhaps comes back to my being a German and the child of war children. I really struggled with my country's historic inheritance. And when I was at Harvard in the late 80s, I thought quite seriously about staying and about just throwing off the baggage. And I, at some point, just made a conscious decision to not throw it off, but to assume it. And I'm going to stick with that. I'm not going to go back on that. And so I don't have the option of going through the revolving door in America. And it is a revolving door that, to my great regret, doesn't exist in Germany. It's, as you know, very rare for people from the journalistic or think tank sphere to go into government in Germany, which I regret, not because I desperately want power, but because I think I would learn a great deal about the constraints under which power is exercised. I think it would just be useful, and maybe I would have something to contribute. But people like me, I think, have a very limited range of jobs that are feasible. Government speaker is typical, and there's just no way in hell anybody's going to get me to do that. If policy planning, I could see, but somebody would have to ask me. And the other thing in Germany is, of course, that people always want you to really have declared your political colors. And I made another conscious decision fairly early on, which was to never become a member of a party. That was important for me as a journalist, for my independence, and I've stuck with that as well. So anybody who wants to hire me for a government job will have to accept that I'm not a member of a party. But I don't think anybody will, frankly. I don't think anybody's going to ask.
Then, for now, Constanze Stelzenmüller, let me thank you very warmly for your very powerful analysis of the current transatlantic relationship and especially the German position in all of this. Thank you very much. Good luck with all your work in Washington then for the coming future. And of course, thank you very much for everyone who was with us during this conversation on behalf of the Netherlands Atlantic Association and the Netherlands Atlantic Youth. Please check out their website for upcoming events and stay tuned for this Atlantic dialogue. Thank you very much all.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm sorry this was not more of a conversation with your listeners. I feel like I talked far too much, but if anybody still has questions, feel free to send them my way. There is a sort of field where you can email people on my expert page at Brookings if I've left out something and you have an urgent desire to know more. But thank you for hosting me. This is lovely, right? And very nice to meet you. I hope we can meet sometime in person soon.
Would be great. Thank you very much, Constanze Stelzenmüller, and thanks to all of you. Dank je voor het kijken.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.